On the 11th of November, 1880, inside the cold stone walls of Melbourne jail, the final chapter of Australia's most notorious bushranger's life was about to be written. The outlaw who had defied the law, robbed banks, killed 3 police officers, and waged a bloody war against authority was now facing the gallows. Inside Melbourne jail, the atmosphere was tense. The governor received the execution warrant and gave a solemn nod. Then came an unusual figure, a grey-haired, weathered man named Elijah Upjohn, chosen as the hangman. Ironically, he was himself a prisoner, convicted of larceny, now tasked with sending another man to his death. Kelly, ever defiant, resisted as his arms were pinned behind him. "There is no need for tying me," he protested, but it was futile. Strapped and subdued, he was led out, his once jaunty air replaced by a pallid, grim expression. Stepping onto the gallows, he surveyed the crowd below. The man who had faced down police, robbed banks, and waged a guerrilla war against authority was now powerless. He had intended to make a final speech, perhaps a last act of defiance, but fear, or perhaps resignation, silenced him. Instead, he uttered the simple words, "Ah, well, I suppose it has come to this." A white cap was placed over his head. The noose tightened around his neck. A moment of stillness. Then, the executioner pulled the bolt. The trapdoor gave way. Ned Kelly, Australia's most infamous outlaw, fell 8 feet through the gallows, his body hanging 4 feet above the cold basement floor. The priests who had accompanied him whispered their prayers. The onlookers remained frozen in silence. Death was said to be instant. By 5 minutes past 10 o'clock, it was over. One of the swiftest executions in Melbourne jail's history. No grand spectacle, no dramatic pause, just the cold efficiency of the hangman's work. Half an hour later, Ned Kelly's lifeless body was cut down, placed into a hospital cart, and quietly transported to the dead house. Outside the prison walls, a crowd of 4,000 had gathered, men, women, children, and countless larrikin youths, most from the lower classes. They waited anxiously for a sign, a black flag raised above the jail, the traditional signal that justice had been served. But no such flag appeared. As the clock struck 10, all eyes turned skyward in anticipation. Nothing. In that eerie silence, a woman fell to her knees at the prison entrance, whispering a final prayer for the condemned man. To some, he was a murderer. To others, a martyr. As the spectators slowly dispersed, the execution of Edward Kelly, better known as Ned Kelly, was complete. Or was it? At the time, Australia was nothing more than a loose collection of 6 British colonies, still searching for an identity, still craving its own mythology. In the absence of great national figures, Australia picked up the scattered remains of a bushranger's life and forged a legend. But what was Ned Kelly, really? A thief? A murderer? A hero? To many, Kelly was a self-fashioned rebel, a man who claimed to fight against a system that unfairly targeted poor Irish settlers. But the reality tells a different story, one of robbery, violence, and murder, woven into the daily fabric of Kelly's life and that of his extended family. And yet, more than 140 years after his death, his name endures, his story debated, his face immortalized in iron. So why? Why has Australia chosen to turn a criminal into a legend? Perhaps the true story of Ned Kelly isn't about the man himself, but about what people needed him to be. Ned Kelly's execution was meant to be the end of his story. Instead, it was just the beginning of his legend. To understand how a convicted criminal became an enduring national icon, we must go back, not to Stringybark Creek, not to Glenrowan, but much further. Before Ned Kelly wore his famous suit of armor, before he picked up a gun, before he even uttered a word, there was Red Kelly. Ned Kelly's father, John Kelly, better known as Red Kelly, was born in 1820 in Clonbrogan near Moeglass, County Tipperary, Ireland. Like many of his generation, Red Kelly's life was shaped by poverty and desperation. At 21 years old, he was found guilty of stealing 2 pigs, a crime that sealed his fate. He was sentenced to transportation, a brutal punishment that saw thousands of Irish convicts exiled to the farthest reaches of the British Empire. Shackled and bound, he boarded the convict ship Prince Regent, bound for Van Diemen's Land, modern-day Tasmania. Red Kelly arrived in Hobart Town on the 2nd of January, 1842, a prisoner in a land as unforgiving as the sentence that had brought him there. But unlike many convicts, his punishment had an end date. In January 1848, he was granted his certificate of freedom, allowing him to carve out a new life in a new land. Seeking opportunity, Red Kelly moved to the Port Phillip District, where he found work as a carpenter for James Quinn, a farmer in Wallan, north of Melbourne. It was here that fate intervened. He fell in love with Ellen Quinn, his employer's daughter. On the 18th of November, 1850, at St. Francis Church in Melbourne, Red Kelly married Ellen, an 18-year-old Irish immigrant from County Antrim. Like many others, they followed the lure of gold when the Victorian Gold Rush began in 1851, hoping to find their fortune. And for a time, they did. Their mining efforts were successful enough to purchase a small freehold property in Beverage, north of Melbourne. It seemed, for a brief moment, that Red Kelly had escaped his past. But history would prove that fate had other plans. Because on December 1854, in a modest home in Beverage, a child was born who would become one of the most controversial figures in Australian history. His name was Edward Kelly, better known as Ned Kelly. Just 37 kilometres north of Melbourne, the township of Beverage sits quietly, holding onto its small claim to fame. It was here that Ned Kelly was born and spent the first 9 years of his life. Beverage, named after Scottish sheep farmer Andrew Beverage, who built the Hunter's Tryst Inn in 1845, was once a modest stop along the routes to Victoria's booming goldfields. But by the 1860s, its importance was fading. Newer, more direct routes, Mount Alexander Road, now the Calder Highway, and the Great Western Road, were drawing travellers elsewhere, and the arrival of railways further diminished the town's role. Amidst this shifting landscape, the Kelly family struggled. Ned Kelly was the third child of John Kelly and Ellen Kelly. His exact birth date was never officially recorded, but it is widely believed to have been in December 1854. The couple would go on to have 7 more children, raising them under increasingly harsh and unforgiving conditions. The Kellys' patch of land in Beverage was poor farming country, and their hardships took a toll. Red Kelly turned to drinking heavily, and within 15 months of purchasing their land, he was forced to sell at a loss of £350. The family moved to a tiny shack on a quarter-acre block in town, a sign of their worsening fortunes. Yet, remnants of the Kellys' time in Beverage remain. The cottage where young Ned lived still stands today, on Kelly Street, a rare physical link to his early years. It is believed that John Kelly built the house in 1859, when Ned was around 5 years old. His younger brother, Dan Kelly, was born in that very home, unknowingly destined to follow his older brother into infamy. Meanwhile, the Hunter's Tryst Tavern, built by Andrew Beveridge in 1841, became a favoured drinking hole for Red Kelly. The old pub, once echoing with the laughter and woes of the district's struggling settlers, still stands today, now a lively country pub and a popular family dining spot, its connection to history lingering in the air. For Ned Kelly, Beverage was not a place of legend, it was simply the beginning of a life shaped by hardship, survival, and the ever-present weight of struggle. By 1863, at just 8 years old, Ned Kelly had his first encounter with the law. He stood in the Kilmore Courthouse, not as a defendant, but as a witness, brought there by his mother, Ellen Kelly, to provide an alibi for his uncle James. James was charged with stealing 13 head of cattle, a crime that carried severe consequences. The young Ned, still a child, took the stand in an attempt to sway the court. But his testimony failed to save his uncle, who was sentenced to 3 years of hard labor. It was a defining moment. Ned was barely old enough to understand the legal system, yet he was already standing on the fringes of criminality, a world that would later consume him. Despite the hardships of home life, Ned did receive an education. He attended school at the Beverage Catholic Church and School, along with his sisters Annie and Maggie. The former St. John's Catholic Church, where young Ned sat in class, still stands today, a Gothic bluestone relic of a bygone era. Constructed between 1857 and 1862, the church doubled as a school, serving the small Catholic community of Beverage. Located at the corner of Lithgow and Spring Streets, the building no longer hosts religious services and remains closed to the public, yet it endures as a significant historical landmark, one of the few places still standing that once knew the young Ned Kelly. For a brief time, his life followed a normal path, one of school lessons and childhood innocence. But the shadow of crime and hardship loomed ever closer, pulling him toward the life that would ultimately define him. In 1864, the Kelly family left Beverage behind, moving 75 kilometers north to the small but thriving rural township of Avenel, nestled along the banks of Hughes Creek. That concludes part 1 of the Ned Kelly story. Stay tuned for part 2, coming soon. Don't forget to check our channel regularly for new episodes, and if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and leave your comments below.